25 Creepy True Driving Alone at Night Horror Stories. Story 1. The Shadow on the Road. It was a cold, moonless night when I decided to hit the road alone. The journey was supposed to be uneventful, just a 2-hour drive to my parents' house in the countryside. With the radio playing softly and the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt, everything seemed normal. But as I drove on, the lights of the city fell away, and the darkness of the deserted road began to weigh on me. The trees along the highway became menacing shadows, and the feeling of being watched began to bother me. After almost an hour of driving, I began to feel that something was wrong. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the road seemed endless. Then, in the corner of my peripheral vision, I noticed a movement. Something rushed past the edge of the road, too fast for me to identify. I sped up a little, trying to dispel the idea that it could just be an animal. But what made me shudder was the fact that, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw an indistinct shadow that seemed to be following me, maintaining the same speed as the car. I accelerated even more, my heart racing, as I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the shadow was still there, floating in the darkness as if it were part of it. Finally, as I turned a sharp corner, I felt the car slow down abruptly, as if something invisible had grabbed the bumper. The engine roared, but the car barely moved. That's when I saw it. Through the rearview mirror, that shadow approached the rear window, and in the next instant, a pale, cadaverous hand slammed against the glass. I screamed, hit the gas as hard as I could, and suddenly the shadow disappeared. The car started responding again, and I drove without stopping until I reached the nearest town, where I finally felt safe. I never took that road at night again. Story 2. The Invisible Passenger. I had just left work, and the clock was already past 11 at night. My journey home took about an hour, crossing empty, poorly lit roads. With tiredness weighing me down, all I wanted was to get there soon. Halfway there, heavy rain began to fall, making driving more complicated. As I passed an isolated point on the road, where there were only trees and a thick fog was forming, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. A lone figure standing on the side of the road. Even knowing the dangers, I decided to stop and see if he needed help. I lowered my window and called out to the person, but there was no answer. She just slowly turned around and, without saying a word, got into the back seat of the car. As soon as the door closed, an intense chill took over the car, as if winter had invaded the interior. I looked through the rearview mirror, trying to see the passenger's face, but the darkness inside the car was too thick. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, with the sound of rain hammering on the roof and glass. I asked where the person wanted to go, but received no reply. The feeling of unease only grew, and I began to regret having stopped. I continued driving, not knowing what to do, when something strange happened. The radio, which had been switched off, came on by itself and began to tune in to a disturbing static. Fear began to take hold of me, and my only desire was to get rid of that ride, which seemed increasingly supernatural. Then, in an instant of courage, I looked through the rearview mirror again, forcing my eyes to see something in the darkness. And that's when I realized the impossible. There was no one in the back seat. The door was closed. I had felt the weight of the person getting into the car, but now the seat was empty. A shiver ran down my spine, and before I could process what was happening, a woman's voice echoed through the car, whispering, "You shouldn't have stopped." With my heart in my mouth, I sped off to the nearest town, where I got out of the car without looking back. Since then, I've avoided driving alone at night, for fear of meeting another invisible passenger. Story 3. The Trucker from Beyond. It was dawn and I was on the last leg of a long car journey, trying to get home before dawn. The road was deserted, and the only company I had was the sound of the engine and the monotonous hum of the wheels on the asphalt. The night was particularly dark, with no moon or stars to light the way. Only the headlights of my car cut through the darkness in front of me. Everything seemed normal until, on the horizon, I saw the glow of oncoming headlights. A huge truck was coming in the opposite direction, its high beams illuminating everything around it. The feeling that I was finally crossing paths with another human being on the road should have been comforting, but instead an inexplicable discomfort washed over me. As the truck approached, I noticed something strange. Despite the speed at which I was driving, it didn't seem to be approaching quickly. It was as if it was advancing in slow motion, but at the same time, it was there, coming towards me. When we finally crossed, I felt a violent impact, as if something had hit the side of my car. I was so startled that I almost lost control of the vehicle. I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see the damage, but to my surprise, there was no truck. The road behind me was as empty as before. Confused, I pulled the car over and got out to check, but there was no sign of a collision, no truck and no sound other than the wind. I decided to get back in the car and keep going, but the discomfort only increased. A few kilometers later, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same truck appeared again, this time in front of me, coming at high speed. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, trying to swerve, but it seemed to be chasing me. At the last second, I turned the wheel sharply and the truck drove straight past, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there. I parked on the roadside, shaking, not knowing if what had happened was real or a delirium of fatigue. Then my cell phone, which was on the passenger seat, vibrated. It was an unknown message with just one sentence: "Careful at the next bend." I decided to ignore it and carry on, but on the next bend, I almost lost control of the car when a cow crossed the road. If I had been running as before, it would have been fatal. The warning I received, wherever it came from, saved my life. Since then, I've never doubted the strange things that can happen on the road at night. Story 4. The Lighthouse in the Fog. I had decided to take the coastal road that night, a route I avoided whenever I could because of the dense fog that often covered the region. That night, however, there seemed to be no alternative. The main route was blocked, and I didn't want to delay my journey home any longer. As I drove on, the fog thickened, swallowing up the road and everything around, until I could barely see an inch in front of the car's headlights. The feeling of isolation was intense, as if the world had disappeared, leaving only me, the car, and that road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. As I drove slowly along the fog-shrouded road, I noticed a light flashing in the distance, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was a car headlight, but the way the light moved, irregularly and oscillating, seemed impossible for a vehicle. As I moved forward, the light remained at the same distance, as if it were guiding or observing me. There were no houses or lampposts in that isolated area, which made the presence of that light even more disturbing. The feeling of being followed began to eat away at me, increasing in discomfort with every kilometer I traveled. As the winding road led me towards the light, it seemed to grow in intensity, illuminating the mist around it. Suddenly, without any warning, the light stopped moving and remained static, as if waiting for me. When I finally got close enough, I could see what looked like a slender figure standing in the road, with light emanating from something she was holding. I stopped the car abruptly, my heart pounding wildly. The figure didn't move, it just watched me through the dense fog. Something about her stiff, immobile posture was terribly unsettling, and the thought of getting out of the car to confront her didn't even cross my mind. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, the light began to pulsate, creating dancing shadows in the surrounding mist. Gradually, the figure moved, taking a step backwards, and more lights began to appear around it, as if several figures were emerging from the darkness. Panic seized me, and I knew I had to get out of there immediately. However, when I went to reverse, the car choked and died, leaving me trapped in that surreal situation. Desperate, I tried to start it again, but the engine only groaned in response, as if the car itself was being suffocated by the mist that now seemed alive, closing in on me. With the car dead and the mist engulfing everything around me, I felt I had no choice but to face whatever was out there. I gathered my courage and opened the door, but as I stepped out of the car, I realized that the light had disappeared, along with the figures I saw earlier. The road was once again plunged into silence and darkness. The car's engine started up again on its own, and I didn't wait another second to get out of there. When I finally reached the safety of a gas station miles away, the attendant, upon hearing my story, just shook his head and said, "You saw the lighthouse in the fog. Few survived to tell it." I never took that road again, and to this day I avoid driving alone at night. Story 5. The Child on the Road. It was an ordinary Friday night when I left the city to visit my grandparents in the countryside. The country road was narrow and deserted, lit only by the headlights of my car and the moon, which was hidden behind heavy clouds that night. I was driving leisurely, enjoying the tranquility of the route, when something unexpected caught my eye. A few meters ahead, I saw a small figure on the side of the road. I slowed down, trying to understand what I was seeing. When I got closer, I realized it was a child, apparently alone and disoriented, staring at the headlights. The sight of that child alone on the road deeply disturbed me. I parked the car on the roadside and got out, calling out to the child. The child didn't answer, just stood there, looking at me with a blank expression. The feeling that something was very wrong began to invade me. The air seemed colder around her, and a strange unease grew inside me, as if my instinct was warning me not to come any closer. Even so, I went up to her, asking if she was lost or needed help. It was then that I noticed something even stranger. The child's feet weren't touching the ground. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but fear began to take over. I approached cautiously, asking where it was coming from, but the child remained silent, as still as a statue. When I reached out to touch it, it abruptly pulled back with almost supernatural speed. A shiver ran down my spine, and at that moment I realized I wasn't dealing with something natural. The child finally spoke, in a low, echoing voice, saying only, "You shouldn't be here." It made me freeze with fear, and before I could react, it vanished before my eyes, disappearing into the darkness of the road. I got back into the car, still shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I started the engine and accelerated, but the image of that child wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks, but something inside me knew it was real. A few kilometers down the road, still shaken, I decided to stop at a small roadside bar to collect myself. When I told the barkeeper what I had seen, he turned pale and looked at me with a somber expression. "You've seen the boy from kilometer 37, he said. "For years, he's been appearing to drivers at night, always in the same place." The story the bar owner told me was terrifying. Years ago, a child had been run over on that stretch of road and died on the spot. Since then, it is said that the child's spirit wanders the area, hoping to be noticed by passersby. The idea that I had encountered the ghost of that child left me deeply disturbed. I decided to continue my journey, but with every headlight or reflection I saw on the road, my mind went back to that night. I could no longer drive at night without feeling that something was watching me. And to this day, I avoid that road, fearing that the boy from kilometer 37 might appear again. Story 6. The Way of the Disappeared. I was returning from a meeting late at night when I decided to take a shortcut to save time. The GPS indicated a route along a secondary road which, although more isolated, promised to cut a good deal of time off the journey. As I drove along, the city lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, leaving only darkness and the sound of tires on asphalt. The road seemed endless, and the surrounding landscape became more and more desolate. There were no other cars, not even any streetlights, and I began to wonder if I had made the wrong choice by taking that route. As I made my way along the road, an uncomfortable feeling began to wash over me. The path, which should have been a simple alternative route, seemed to stretch further than usual. Looking around, I noticed that the landscape didn't change, as if I was stuck in an endless loop of dark trees and indistinct bushes. There were no signs of civilization, just the road stretching out in front of me. I began to feel a presence, as if something or someone was watching me from the shadows. Every kilometer I traveled seemed to take me further away from reality, plunging me into a growing sense of isolation and fear. It was then that I noticed a movement in the distance, something I could barely identify through the darkness. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but it soon became clear that it was something more sinister. Shadows appeared on the side of the road, far enough away not to be completely visible, but close enough to make my heart race. With every turn I made, more of these figures appeared, always standing still, always looking in my direction. Discomfort turned to panic and I began to speed up, trying to escape from the road that seemed to be turning into a trap. But the figures kept appearing, as if they were surrounding me, making it impossible to ignore their presence. My fear reached its peak when, on a sharp bend, one of the figures crossed the road in front of me. It was so fast and unexpected that I almost lost control of the car, swerving on instinct. What I saw was just a blur, but enough to realize that it wasn't human. I stopped the car abruptly, panting, trying to pull myself together. The silence that followed was oppressive, and when I finally looked through the rearview mirror, the figure was standing in the middle of the road, as if watching me. Without a second thought, I hit the gas, determined to get out of there as quickly as possible. But deep down, a part of me knew that something darker was happening. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I saw lights in the distance, signaling the end of that cursed road. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to try to understand what had happened. I asked the attendant about the road I had taken, and he looked at me with a serious expression. "That road shouldn't be on the GPS," he said. "Many who have tried to use it have never come back." It gave me the creeps, and I decided not to question it any further. I just got in the car and drove home, promising myself that I would never take unknown shortcuts again. Since that night, the dark roads have never seemed safe to me, and the fear of finding another path of the disappeared accompanies me on every night drive. Story 7. The Red Light. It was one of those endless nights at work, and I was driving home, tired and longing only for my bed. The highway was practically deserted, with only a few car lights in the distance. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the sky completely dark. Suddenly, up ahead, I noticed a red light flashing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a traffic sign or an emergency signal, but there was nothing around to justify it. I slowed down, curious and a little apprehensive, trying to understand what the light was. As I got closer to the red light, I noticed that it was flashing irregularly, as if it were failing. Strangely, as I advanced, the light always seemed to maintain the same distance, as if it were guiding me or trying to lure me further away. A feeling of unease began to grow inside me, but so did curiosity. There were no cars or buildings in sight, and the light didn't seem to have a visible source. It was as if it was floating in the air, faintly illuminating the area around it. The highway was deserted, and the absence of any other signs of life only made the situation even more disturbing. After a few minutes, I began to notice something even stranger. The few cars that had previously been on the highway had completely disappeared, leaving me alone with that mysterious red light in front of me. The surrounding darkness seemed denser, as if the light was draining the vitality out of the night, making everything more sinister. I tried to speed up in the hope of overtaking the light, but it was still ahead, keeping the same pace as me. My heart began to beat faster, and a sense of imminent danger came over me. It was as if the light was taking me somewhere I shouldn't go, and the oppressive silence of the night only intensified this sense of fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the red light stopped moving and remained fixed on the horizon. I took courage and slowed down, trying to see what was there. To my amazement, the light revealed the scene of a car crash, but there was no sign of recent activity. The vehicle was completely destroyed, and the light seemed to be emanating from inside it. I stood paralyzed, watching the bizarre scene and trying to understand what was going on. Suddenly, the light flashed violently, and I caught sight of an indistinct figure inside the car, looking directly at me. The shock knocked me backwards and, without a second thought, I hit the gas, determined to leave it behind. As I sped away, the light disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the darkness of the highway. My heart was racing and the silence that followed was deafening. When I finally got home, I could barely sleep, tormented by the images of that night. The next day, I decided to do some research on that stretch of road and discovered that a serious accident had occurred there years ago. Since then, many drivers have reported seeing a mysterious red light in that same spot, always accompanied by an inexplicable feeling of terror. From then on, I avoided that highway at night, fearful of encountering the red light again and whatever it was trying to show. Story 8. The Abandoned Gas Station. It was late at night, and I was driving along a deserted highway when I realized that the gas tank was almost empty. I was in the middle of nowhere with no sign of civilization in sight, and I started to get worried. I continued driving for a few more kilometers, hoping to find somewhere to fill up. Finally, I spotted a sign indicating a gas station a few minutes away. Relieved, I followed the sign and took the next exit. The side road was even darker and more deserted, but I had no other choice. When I arrived at the service station, I noticed that the lights were off and the place looked abandoned, but I still decided to investigate. I parked the car near the gas stations, noticing that everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had been there for a long time. The structure of the service station was visibly weathered, with broken windows and faded paintwork. Even so, something pushed me to get out of the car and see if there was any chance of getting fuel. The feeling of abandonment was palpable, and a heavy silence hung in the air. I opened the door to the convenience store, expecting to find total darkness, but to my surprise, a few dim lights were still on, casting strange shadows around the place. As I entered the store, I was immediately overcome by a feeling of unease. The shelves were practically empty, apart from a few old and dusty products. The cash register was covered in cobwebs and a musty smell permeated the air. As I walked through the corridors, I felt as if I was being watched, even though there was no one in sight. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the distant sound of something dripping, perhaps water running down some broken pipe. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, like light footsteps, coming from behind the counter. My heart raced, and I had the feeling that there was someone else there with me. With my heart racing, I cautiously approached the counter, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. Peering behind it, I saw nothing but stacked boxes and an ajar door leading to a dark corridor. I decided I'd better get out of there, but before I could move, I clearly heard a voice whispering my name. Frozen with fear, I looked around, but saw no one. The voice sounded close, as if it was next to me, but I was completely alone. Sensing that something was very wrong, I ran to the store door, but before I could leave, a shadow passed quickly out of the corner of my eye, disappearing into the darkness. I went straight to the car, without looking back, and started the engine as fast as I could. As I pulled out of the service station, I looked in the rearview mirror and, for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the entrance to the store, watching me as I drove off. The feeling of relief only came when I returned to the main road and the lights of the city began to appear on the horizon. A few days later, when talking to a friend about what had happened, he told me that the service station had been closed years ago, after a mysterious fire that took the life of the former owner. Since then, several people have reported seeing or hearing strange things when they stop there at night. I haven't been able to forget the experience, and to this day, I avoid driving along that road, fearing that I'll come across that cursed place again. Story 9. The Viaduct of Doom. I was returning home after a long journey when I passed an old viaduct, known for its dark legends. It was late at night and the road was deserted, except for the dim light of my headlights illuminating the road ahead. Crossing that viaduct always made me apprehensive, as there were rumors that it was haunted. It was said that several people had taken their own lives there, and that their spirits roamed the area, waiting to be seen by lonely drivers. As I drove along the viaduct, the feeling of unease only grew, and I began to feel that something was watching me. As I crossed the viaduct, I felt an oppressive presence around me, as if the air was getting heavier. The road seemed longer than usual, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every second. It was then that I instinctively looked up and saw an indistinct figure, apparently slumped or hanging off the side of the viaduct. My heart raced and a wave of dread washed over me. The figure seemed static, but what terrified me most was the possibility that it wasn't just an illusion. The image made me speed up, but the discomfort remained, as if something was following me. After crossing the viaduct, I tried to push the disturbing sight out of my mind, but something inside me told me that it wasn't just a trick of my tired eyes. The feeling that I wasn't alone persisted, and I decided to turn on the radio to try to drown out the oppressive silence of the car. As the music played, my thoughts returned to what I had seen. When I finally got home, I did a quick search online and discovered that other drivers had already reported the same experience. The figure I saw was common in the stories of people who passed by the viaduct at night, and some said it was a trapped spirit, reenacting its death over and over again. In the days that followed, I couldn't get that image out of my head. Even though I tried to rationalize what I had seen, the fear continued to haunt me. It was then that I began to notice something even more disturbing. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Instead, it seemed to accompany me no matter where I was. One night, while driving down a deserted street, I saw a shadow in the rearview mirror that seemed to move along with the car. The shadow resembled the figure I had seen on the viaduct. My heart raced and a chill ran down my spine. I sped up, trying to ward off the terror, but the shadow always seemed to be there, lurking, as if waiting for something. The constant fear began to wear me down, and I decided that I could no longer ignore what was happening. I returned to the viaduct during the day, hoping that the sunlight might reveal some detail that I had missed. When I arrived, I walked around the site, trying to find some rational explanation. There was no sign of the figure I had seen, but the place still exuded a gloomy aura, as if imbued with the energy of past tragedies. When I spoke to a local resident, he told me that the viaduct was known as the Viaduct of Doom, and that those who saw the figure were doomed to be persecuted by it. I've avoided that road ever since, but the feeling of being watched has never completely disappeared. Story 10. The Ghost Truck. It was a cold and lonely night, and I was driving along a deserted mountain road. The winding road and the surrounding darkness created an unsettling atmosphere. As I drove up the road, I noticed the headlights of a truck behind me, fast approaching. At first, I didn't think much of it, I just kept driving, but something about the way the truck moved started to make me nervous. It was following too closely, almost glued to my bumper, and its presence was oppressive. The high headlights reflected in the rearview mirror, obscuring my vision and adding to the feeling of discomfort. This situation began to make me really tense. I tried to accelerate, hoping to create a safe distance between me and the truck, but it kept pace, following me closely. The road was narrow and full of bends, which made it even more dangerous to have that heavy vehicle so close. I started to consider stopping on the shoulder to let him pass, but something stopped me. There was something wrong with that truck. The way it always seemed to keep the same distance, like a shadow that wouldn't let me escape, was disturbing. Fear began to take hold of me, and my instinct screamed that I needed to get out of there. The road seemed endless, and the terror completely overwhelmed me. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel as I tried to escape the nightmare. It was then that the truck began to move even more aggressively, rocking from side to side, as if it wanted to force me off the road. In a panic, I tried to keep control of the car as it threatened to push me into the abyss beside the road. The sound of the truck's engine was deafening, mixed with the roar of the wind in the mountains. Just when I thought it would be the end of me, the truck suddenly accelerated and passed me, disappearing into the darkness ahead, as if it had never been there. Finally, I reached a more populated area and stopped at a gas station to try to catch my breath. My mind was in a whirl, trying to process what had happened. Talking to the attendant at the station, he gave me a serious look when he heard my story. "You found the ghost truck," he said in a low voice. "Many years ago, a truck driver died in a terrible accident on this road, and ever since, his truck has been seen chasing lonely drivers at night. It gave me the creeps, and I promised myself that I would never drive through those mountains at night again. The terror of that experience has stayed with me, and even now, I avoid deserted roads for fear of running into the truck that should never have been there in the first place." Story 11. The Woman in White. It was a cold, rainy dawn, and I was driving home after a long night at work. The road was practically deserted, and the only thing that broke the monotony of the road was the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the windshield. I was driving along a rural highway, surrounded by open fields and trees that rustled in the wind. Suddenly, something by the side of the road caught my eye. Through the curtain of rain, I saw the figure of a woman, dressed in white, standing alone under a tree. The image was so unexpected that I almost lost control of the car, but I managed to slow down and approach her, curious and worried. As I got closer, the woman's figure became clearer. She was completely still, her white dress contrasting with the darkness of the night and the rain around her. Something about the way she was standing there seemed out of the ordinary, but the urge to help spoke louder. I pulled the car over to the side of the road and lowered the window, asking if she needed any help. The woman slowly turned towards me, revealing a pale, expressionless face. Her eyes seemed empty, dull, and an immediate feeling of discomfort came over me. Even so, I offered to give her a lift and, without saying a word, she got into the back of the car. As soon as she settled into the car, a sensation of intense cold spread through the interior of the vehicle, as if the temperature itself had dropped dramatically. I looked through the rearview mirror, trying to make out the woman's face, but the darkness in the back seat seemed to swallow up her figure, leaving only an indistinct outline. I asked where she wanted to go, but the only answer was a disconcerting silence. As I drove, the discomfort grew. There was something deeply wrong with the situation, but I couldn't identify what. What disturbed me most was the fact that, despite the silence, I felt as if an oppressive presence was weighing down on me, making the air inside the car almost unbreathable. After a few minutes of driving in total silence, the feeling of tension reached its peak. I looked through the rearview mirror again, determined to understand what was going on. To my surprise, the back seat was empty. The woman who had been sitting there moments before had simply disappeared without a trace. The shock caused me to brake sharply, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. I turned in my seat to look back, but there was nothing there except darkness. Fear overtook me, and a wave of panic made me speed up to get out of there as quickly as possible. I couldn't understand what had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay on that road for another second. When I finally got home, still shaking with fear, I tried to forget what had happened, convincing myself that it had just been an illusion caused by tiredness. However, a few days later, when talking to a friend about what had happened, he told me a disturbing story. The woman in white was a local legend, known for appearing to lonely drivers on that very road. It was said that she had died in an accident many years ago and that her spirit wandered, trying to find its way home. The idea that I had given a ghost a lift left me deeply shaken. Since then, I've avoided driving alone at night, fearful of meeting the woman in white again and the unbearable cold she brings with her. Story 12. The Sound in the Forest. It was a particularly dark night when I decided to take a shortcut along a road that cut through a dense forest. The road was not very busy, and the tall trees formed a kind of natural tunnel, blocking out the moonlight. The feeling of isolation was intense, and the only thing that broke the silence was the sound of the car's tires on the asphalt. I was beginning to regret my choice, but I kept driving, anxious to reach my destination soon. It was then that I suddenly heard something that shouldn't have been there. A distant sound like muffled screams, echoing through the trees. The sound was disturbing, and I soon realized that it was coming from inside the forest. The distant cries echoed through the trees, carried by the wind, and became increasingly difficult to ignore. They were human sounds, but there was something strange about them, a distorted quality that made my skin crawl. I tried to turn up the radio to drown out the screams, but the sound continued, as if it was getting closer by the second. My heart raced and a sense of urgency overtook me. Although every instinct told me to keep going and ignore what I was hearing, something made me slow down. I stopped the car for a moment, trying to listen better, and that's when I realized that the sound seemed to circulate around me, as if it were being emitted from several directions at once. While I was standing there, trying to decide what to do, something sped across the road, almost colliding with my car. It was an indistinct figure, too fast for me to identify. The shock made me jump with fright, and the feeling of dread intensified. I turned on the high beams, trying to illuminate the road and the surroundings, but all I could see were shadows moving between the trees. as if something or someone was surrounding me. The scream became louder and clearer, as if it were coming from all sides, and the sound was now accompanied by a low murmur, incomprehensible, but filled with an anguish that seemed to cut through the air. I knew I had to get out of there, but fear paralyzed me. Finally, forcing myself to act, I stepped on the accelerator and continued driving, ignoring the sound that seemed to be chasing the car down the road. But as I drove on, I noticed something strange. The screams began to turn into low, sinister laughter. It was as if the forest itself was mocking me, every tree and shadow joining in a macabre symphony. When I finally saw the end of the road approaching, the sound abruptly ceased, leaving a deafening silence in its place. I passed through the last few meters of that forest, feeling the weight of the trees diminishing, but knowing that something terrible had happened there. I left that road without looking back, but the feeling that something was still watching me stayed with me. When I got home, still shaking from what I had experienced, I tried to explain it to myself. Perhaps it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and darkness of the forest. However, the laughter and whispers kept echoing in my mind, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. A few days later, when I told the story to a local resident, he looked at me seriously and said that the road was avoided by many people in the area because of the strange sounds many had heard there. According to him, the forest had been the scene of tragic events, and since then, anyone who dared to pass that way at night would hear the wails of the souls trapped there. Since then, I've avoided roads that cut through forests at night, fearing I'd hear those dark cries and laughter again. Story 13. The House by the Side of the Road. During a violent storm, I was driving along a back road in the countryside, trying to get to my destination as quickly as possible. The torrential rain made visibility difficult, and the lightning that cut across the sky briefly illuminated the desolate landscape around me. Suddenly, I spotted an illuminated house by the side of the road, a sign of life in the midst of the darkness and the storm. With the weather bad and the road increasingly difficult to travel, I decided to stop and ask for help or at least temporary shelter until the rain subsided. I pulled the car over and approached the house, but as I got closer, something seemed strange. The lights were on, but there was no sign of movement inside. When I reached the porch of the house, I knocked on the door, hoping that someone would appear. The rain continued to fall heavily, and I was soaking wet. I waited for a few seconds, but no one answered. The place was eerily silent, with only the sound of the storm all around. I looked out of the windows and saw that, despite the lights being on, the house seemed strangely deserted. Something told me not to go in, but the cold and the discomfort of the rain were greater than my instinct for self-preservation. I decided to try the handle and, to my surprise, the door opened with an ominous creak, revealing a bright but empty interior. I entered, calling out for someone, but there was no answer. As I explored the interior of the house, I realized that the decoration was old, as if no one had lived there for many years. The lights cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of desolation and abandonment. Despite this, everything was perfectly organized, as if the residents had just left, leaving everything in order. There was a strange feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, I found no one. However, something more disturbing happened. As I walked through the rooms, I began to hear light footsteps coming from upstairs, as if someone was moving stealthily through the house. My breathing became heavy, and a wave of dread began to grow inside me. I decided to follow the sound of the footsteps, even though fear dominated my mind. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet, until I reached the dark corridor on the second floor. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. I tried to turn on the lights, but the switches didn't work, leaving me in the dark. When I finally reached the bedroom door where the sound seemed to be coming from, I hesitated for a moment before opening it. As I pushed the door open, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, facing away from me. My heart raced, and for a moment I was paralyzed with terror. When I took a step back, the figure disappeared before my eyes, as if it had never been there. Fear overtook me and I ran out of the house without looking back. I got into the car, started the engine and accelerated to get out of there as quickly as possible. The rain was still coming down heavily, but the feeling of being followed was even more intense. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small cafe to recover. I told the attendant what had happened, who looked at me with a serious expression and told me that the house had been abandoned for decades, ever since a tragic accident took the lives of its residents. Since then, many drivers have reported seeing the lights on and hearing strange sounds when they stopped there during storms. I've never been back on that road and, to this day, I get goosebumps remembering what I saw in that house by the side of the road. Story 14. The radio that won't stop. I was driving home on a cold and lonely night, and the silence in the car was disturbing. So I turned on the radio to try to ease the tension of the journey. I tuned into some station, hoping to hear some music to distract me. But what I found was something very different. The station I had chosen was playing strange static, interrupted by low, incomprehensible murmurs. At first, I thought it was just interference, but the feeling of discomfort began to grow as the murmurs seemed to get louder and clearer. I decided to change the station, but for some reason the radio refused to respond, as if it were stuck on that sinister channel. I tried changing the station several times, but the radio remained fixed on the static and the disturbing murmurs. With each failed attempt, the discomfort grew, and a feeling that something was deeply wrong settled over me. The murmurs became more distinct, almost as if they were voices conversing in an unknown language. The sound was mesmerizing and terrifying at the same time, as if it was trying to trap me in some kind of trance. The road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the feeling of isolation intensified with every second. It was as if the radio was creating a bubble of sound around me, isolating me from the outside world. As I continued to drive, trying not to pay attention to what was coming out of the radio, something even more disturbing happened. The murmurs began to change from mere incomprehensible whispers into words in Portuguese, spoken in a low, sinister tone. Worst of all, these words seemed to be speaking directly to me. They mentioned details of my life, things that nobody else knew. The shock was so great that I almost lost control of the car. Fear overwhelmed me, and I tried everything to turn off the radio, but it continued to work, as if it had a life of its own. The voices told me to stop the car, to listen to what they had to say, but my instincts screamed at me to get out of there as quickly as possible. I decided to try one last thing, to turn off the car and remove the key from the ignition, in the hope that the radio would finally stop. When I did, the engine went silent, but the radio continued to work, filling the car with that disturbing voice. Now there was no longer any doubt. This was unnatural. The voice became louder, more insistent, and I could feel an oppressive presence around me, as if something invisible was trying to reach me. My desperation grew, and I knew I had to get out of there, but my hands were stuck to the steering wheel, and fear immobilized me. Finally, the voice whispered one last sentence before falling silent. "You should never have listened to me." In the next instant, the radio switched itself off, plunging the car into a deafening silence. I sat in the car in silence, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. The fear was still there, but now mixed with a deep sense of relief that the nightmare was over. I started the car again and drove on, determined never to listen to that radio station again. When I got home, I tried to forget what had happened, but the words spoken over the radio kept echoing in my mind. The next day, I took the car to a garage, but the mechanic couldn't find anything wrong with the radio. Even so, I never turned it on again during my journeys, fearing that that sinister voice might find me again. Since then, I've avoided driving alone at night, especially on deserted roads, where the silence can be disturbingly broken by something that shouldn't be there. Story 15. Returning to the old road. I decided to take the old road I used to travel during my childhood, driven by nostalgia and the desire to revisit the places that marked my youth. It was a route that my family and I often took, but which had been practically abandoned over the years. The road, narrow and winding, meandered between hills and dense forests, and seemed not to have changed much since the last time I had traveled it. As I drove, childhood memories began to return, bringing a bittersweet feeling of simpler times. However, as night fell, the road, which had once seemed welcoming, began to take on a darker, more oppressive aura. As I progressed, the feeling of nostalgia was gradually replaced by something more unsettling. The road, which had once been familiar, now looked strangely different. The trees that lined it were denser, their canopies blocking out almost all the light from the sky, plunging the road into a constant gloom. What had once seemed welcoming now seemed oppressive, as if the trees were closing in around me. The feeling that something wasn't right began to grow, but I carried on, determined to reach the village where I spent part of my childhood. However, the further I went, the more the surrounding landscape seemed to distort, as if the road itself was trying to take me away from that place. It was then, as I rounded a sharp bend, that I saw something on the side of the road that made me brake abruptly. A figure was standing there, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. At first glance, it looked like a human being, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. As I got closer, I realized that their clothes were from the same era as my childhood, as if the person had been trapped in time. The face was partially hidden by the darkness, but what little I could see gave me a chill. It looked like someone I knew, but couldn't identify. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for something. My discomfort grew and the urge to turn around and leave was almost irresistible, but there was something about the figure that held me in place. With my heart racing, I decided to stop the car and get out to confront the figure. Every step I took towards her seemed to become more difficult, as if the air around me was becoming heavier. When I got close enough, the figure finally moved, slowly turning to face me. The face I saw was my own, but a younger version, as if I were looking at a living memory of myself. The figure didn't say anything, but its gaze was full of sadness and melancholy. It was then that memories began to flood my mind, memories of moments I had forgotten or repressed. The figure seemed to carry all the pain and regrets of my childhood, and as I realized this, a feeling of despair came over me. It wasn't just a road that I had revisited, but the ghosts of my past. The sight of that younger version of myself was so shocking that it made me back away quickly, stumbling back to the car. I got in and slammed the door, fear and confusion dominating my thoughts. When I looked back to where the figure had been, it had disappeared, as if it had never been there. The road in front of me looked different, less welcoming, and the surrounding darkness seemed deeper. I started the car and, without looking back, turned around and sped off, leaving that road and its dark memories behind. When I finally reached a busier road, the relief I felt was indescribable, but the feeling that something had been left behind, something that perhaps should never have been revisited, remained. Ever since that night, I've avoided old roads and places that hold forgotten memories, fearing what else I might find.